Thanks, Susie. Do we have everybody in here okay? Are we ready to start?
Yeah, it looks like some more people might be coming in, but we could get started.
Okay, great. Thank you. Apologies for the delay. We had some Zoom technical difficulties this evening, so we appreciate your patience. My name is Jennifer Labadia Colon. I am the Baldwin Middle School PTO president. We were approached by Guilford Day. They asked us to collaborate with them on getting some information out on marijuana and vaping use in youth in Guilford. They reached out to the Baldwin PTO, Danny Howard on behalf of Adams Middle School and the high school, and Ornella Rulo. And I think once hearing all of the information that they had, we wholeheartedly agreed to join them on this endeavor. We hosted a small meeting of some community leaders last week in an effort to try and get the message out to them about what's happening in Connecticut with the legalization of retail marijuana, as well as the vaping that's going on and how that would impact our youth. So we want to give parents the power of information as well as provide some resources. And we also want to make sure that you know where to go, whether it's to start those conversations early and get ahead of the situation, or if you find yourself in a situation and you need to get some professional help. Bo Hun and Lisa Ott and Susie White were amazing in grabbing together our panelists. Let me go. Lisa is actually going to be presenting the data on Guilford youth. Then Mr. Regan, the principal for Adams, is going to talk to us about THC content, what we may traditionally know from the 60s, 70s, 80s compared to the retail potency that we see today. Dr. D'Souza is going to give us the neuroscience, all the science and the impact, and some food for thought as we process what happens to youth and teens if they do partake in marijuana usage. Dr. Freeman is going to give us the school's perspective, what they do to arm students with information. And then First Selectman Hoy is going to talk to us about where the town stands. Liz McCall is here. She's going to tell us really what parents can do. That's really a lot of the meat and why we're here, what we can do. And then of course, Lisa's going to wrap it up with some additional resources, which are again, so very helpful. We'll also have a question and answer session at the end. If you like, you could put it in the chat. If you have any questions, so you don't want to forget, we can read those off, or you can ask them at the end. So Lisa, I'm going to hand that over to you now.
Terrific. Thank you, Jennifer. And really, thank you so much for getting on board with this. Guilford Day has been surveying kids in grades, pretty much all kids in grades 7 through 12 since 2010. So we've got some really good data available about kids and their use of the substances that you can see on the screen, and also their perception of risk. And what's interesting is that when I started all of this, Guilford was known as a pot town. Our rate of use was above the state and national average. It was a real problem. And you'll notice with our 2016 numbers that things really started heading in a good direction at that point. And that was after our kids came to us in 2015 and said, look, it is really important. They had learned at a conference that the majority of kids aren't using. And they came to us and said, you know, we really need to get the word out about that. So we listened to what they said, and they're the ones that got us a lot of traction. So one point I really want to make tonight is that our youth leadership is absolutely key in all of this. And I really encourage you to get your kids involved, to empower them in working on this. And, you know, I don't want to set them out there in terms of like getting backlash and that kind of thing. We're really good at figuring out how to get them to help us without, you know, like none of us want to embarrass them, because I know that's really important. Now, looking at the perception of risk, what that is, and Pete Palumbo sums this up in just a great way. When we started with all this, kids were much more concerned about cigarettes than they were about anything else. And so if you look at it, 95% of kids thought that cigarettes were risky, but only 77.8% of kids. And I do want to take a second here to point out, this is grade 7, you know, across the board. So for instance, if you look at it by grade, and we've got all of that data, it's all posted on the Guilford Day website. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. If you ever want to talk about any of this stuff, I'm always happy to talk about it. But especially in the appendices, you can get a lot of information about what kids are thinking and doing. But at any rate, as far as the perception of risk goes, you'll see that it has steadily dropped with marijuana. And that very clearly comes from legalization in all different states. You know, as it's gotten to be more common, the media, big tobacco is a real presence. They've got a ton of money, and they are really using it to promote marijuana as not just harmless, but really a safe alternative. It's low calorie, it won't give you a hangover, all of that kind of thing. And so there's real information. You know, I've got you know, experts here to talk with you tonight about what that is really like. Some kids will say that they have messed with the surveys and that they're not accurate. A couple of things I want to point out are that we talked with kids at the high school during advisory a few years ago and showed them the data. And if you show them the lump number, so for instance, 2021, 8% of kids are using marijuana, they're like, oh, that's way low. And absolutely, for seniors, I think it's up to about 23%. That's absolutely true. Yeah, it is 23%. And then it's 2% for 7th graders. So, you know, that's across the board. But if you break it down by grade with the kids, they agree that these numbers are valid. And also Search Institute, who runs this survey, has all sorts of ways of asking the questions and that kind of thing to double check their numbers. And Guilford actually has a rate of having to toss surveys that's only about half of the national average. So our kids really do take this seriously, and that is something to pay attention to. One of the other reasons we know that they pay attention to the surveys is because it's picked up on the opioid crisis and some other sort of national trends that have been occurring before we even knew that they were happening. And we actually thought the kids might have been messing with the surveys, but then we talked with experts in the field, mental health professionals, ER doctors, school and police, and everybody agreed that that was in line with what they're seeing. So when you see these numbers, you can believe them. Excuse me, I want to let you know that we really need your help with all of this. This is a community effort, and it's going to be something that is more than Guilford Day can take on, more than the schools or the PTOs can take on. We really, really need your help in getting the word out. There's so much information out there right now. It's hard to get things through. So, you know, as we're talking, you know, really think about ways that you can be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Mr. Regan. He's the principal at Adams Middle School. He's going to talk about THC products then and now.
Thank you. It's great to be here tonight with a wonderful panel of experts. I thought a bit about since the last time we met. I came to Guilford in the early 90s after working at an adolescent substance abuse treatment facility in Hamden, and I came to Adams as a part-time drug counselor, basically here in the school for a few days a week, and eventually went to the high school and moved on. But coming in the early 90s, this was an absolute totally different landscape from what we're talking about today. And I can remember even when trying to talk to parents about some of these drugs, the mentality and mindset was, well, what's the deal? It's marijuana. It's not really that harmful. Many parents smoked grass when they were in college. And so that was kind of the mantra. And these products aren't anything close to what was happening back in the early 90s, certainly not the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so as a result of chemistry and botany and horticulture and people getting very savvy about growing marijuana, the product has changed considerably. And I likened it to, in our last discussion, if you look at a beer, and a beer contains plus or minus 5% alcohol. And so by volume, whether you're drinking a sip or an entire beer, that's 5% ethanol. Whereas grain alcohol is 190 proof, that's 95% alcohol. So obviously that's going to impact a brain very, very differently. And so the marijuana that many people are familiar with, or even most people are familiar with, which is why you see a perceived rate of risk as decreasing, is because it's a totally different chemical. The strength of the chemical is based on the amount of THC that is in cannabis. And so the smoking of marijuana, which is the delivery of THC, up until about 10 years ago, was really hovering around anywhere from 1 to 5% THC in the flower. And as time has gone on, since legalization of recreational marijuana started in Colorado about 10 years ago, this has absolutely blossomed. And so one of the things I was even wondering about, Lisa, when kids are answering marijuana questions, is they may be using forms of THC that they don't consider marijuana. That's a possibility, because there may be kids who don't smoke pot, but they use a lot of the things that are in front of us. And the real frustration for parents is that you would never know this is happening, that a kid can have a flash drive a little bit bigger than a flash drive that has a cartridge that has THC to the strength of 90 to 99%. And so think of that young brain, pre-adolescent, adolescent brain, getting hit with a chemical that is the strength of grain alcohol. That is absolutely going to cause a major impact. And so the younger kids start, the frequency that they use, and the strength of the product is going to have an impact, not only on their growth of development, which we'll hear more about, but their likelihood of becoming addicted to it. So if somebody is using a heavy duty chemical with any sort of frequency, and when you look at the vaping products, a kid wouldn't think they're doing pot. They would just think they're hitting a vape, but you're hitting that. Smoking a drug is the fastest way to get it to the brain. So when you get that drug to that brain that fast with a nice name like Sour Patch or something along those lines, that is really causing major concern. And so as a reason, when you look at these products, especially the gummy bears or the inhalers, you would have no idea what that contains. The other piece that happens, the concern is when one of the many derivatives is through edibles. So putting THC oil into cookies or gummies or some of these other products. Kids eat the edible. Oh, I don't really feel anything. Take another one, still don't feel anything, because they're using the process of digestion, and then bang, the drug hits them. And so I have certainly seen at junior high and high school age kids who've had some major concerns, whether it would be a major anxiety or something even further along the extreme of panic, because this chemical hit them that hard. And so when that is the greatest fear, is when you add the strength of these things to pre-adolescent and adolescent brains, it is incredibly scary. And so I feel on many levels as a middle school principal that on some level, it's almost too late to be talking to parents of middle schoolers, is that really being able to have these conversations, the only way that the rate of perceived risk is going to change is if people really understand what can happen as a result of these. And so this is not smoking pot. This is actually using a chemical that's having a very strong impact on someone's brain, and it will severely interrupt the development of kids. And this is so easy to get, easy to use, and easy to get away with, that those are the major concerns that I have. The other fear is that, you know, a kid can say, oh, I got this vape and here you go, but you have no idea what is in that particular cartridge. And so that could be something that someone got from the street. That could be something that someone grabbed from their parents' medical marijuana supply. And that's the other fear, is that kids just, no problem, someone hands it to me and that's the reason I did it. What's the big deal? And that is the stuff that I worry about, again, with the adolescent brain. And I know we're going to hear more about that, of the impact of what happens to them and their decision making. And so one of the things, a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, experimentation is normal. I don't believe that. I think curiosity is very normal, but I don't think it's normal to experiment with these type of drugs and think that kids are going to say, oh, okay, no big deal. I really think it's important that parents have those conversations at much younger ages so that they can build that platform when kids get exposed to these. So I guess that's where I'd like to leave off for now, Lisa.
Thank you. I think as a parent, you're sitting here and you're looking at a gummy bear, and I've got parents from children from elementary through high school. So it's scary to see that this could also be marketed to younger children as well. So thank you. This is very enlightening. Next, we have Dr. D'Souza, who is joining us. He's the professor of psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine. And I'm also going to be handing over the screen to you as well. So let's see.
Okay, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of the science on marijuana and what we should be concerned about for our young people. So I'm going to be brief. I think I have 5 concerns, and I have maybe a few slides addressing each of those concerns. The first is that when kids use marijuana in whatever form it is, whether it's an edible, smoked, or vaped, there are acute effects on cognitive processes. And for those of you who are not familiar with what I mean by that, these are some of the basic building blocks of thinking, and that includes attention, learning, memory, executive function as in planning and execution. And one might argue that these are all critical for the life of a student. After all, our kids are going to school to learn new information and hopefully retain that information. And acutely, at least, marijuana and marijuana-derived products will impact their capacity to pay attention at school, to learn, and to retain information. I've been studying the effects of THC, the principal active constituent of marijuana, in my lab for about 25 years. And I can tell you with certainty that no one learns better, remembers better, pays better attention, under the influence of THC in my experimental studies. And so I think we can say with some degree of confidence that marijuana impairs some of these basic processes that are really important for the life of the student. Another concern that may impact all of us is the effects of cannabis on driving, or marijuana on driving. And when I say all of us, because most of us drive, most of us cross the street, and so on and so forth. And we know that when you're under the influence of cannabis or marijuana, your driving is impaired. And let me spend a minute or two telling you about the impact of marijuana on driving. So we published a paper just last year, and for those of you interested, you can go and look at it yourself. But this is a list of the effects of marijuana or cannabis on driving-related cognition. So these are some of the basic building blocks that we need when we are driving, such as paying attention, estimating time, estimating distance, and reaction time, steadiness and coordination. You name it, this list is an exhaustive list. I'm not going to go over every one of these, but this is just to make the point that marijuana can influence many of those cognitive processes that are essential for driving. And let's not forget our young adolescents who are beginning to drive. They are not the best of drivers. In fact, our insurance companies recognize that young people are probably at the greatest risk of driving. And when you add into that the effects of marijuana, that's really a bad combination. We know from both field tests, in lab studies and field studies in my own lab, and looking at simulated driving, that people generally don't perform well under the influence of marijuana with driving, and your rates for getting into a motor vehicle accident are much higher when you're under the influence of marijuana. So that's a second big concern that I have. What about the effects of chronic cannabis use? Some of our young people are at a stage in their development. We know that adolescence is a time when we are at greatest risk for developing addictions. And so some of the young people who experiment with cannabis may become regular users of cannabis. And we know now from a number of studies that chronic cannabis use is associated with a number of problems in cognition, including problems with attention, learning, memory, executive function, and some studies would suggest that even IQ. Now, what's interesting about this story with IQ is that some studies that were done within the last 10 years would suggest that if you start smoking cannabis in adolescence, even if you quit around the age of 21, in this particular study, when people were tested, their IQ was tested at age 26 and later in their 40s, their IQ was about 8 points lower than where it should have been, suggesting that exposure to cannabis during adolescence can result in long-term consequences that are not reversible. So the point here is that despite people having stopped smoking, their IQ tended to be lower than where it should have been. So this is really troubling and would suggest that exposure to cannabis during adolescence is problematic. And then that brings me to addiction. So until fairly recently, a large segment of the population didn't believe that cannabis was addictive. And in part, I can understand that because the cannabis that was available in the 1960s and 70s had a THC content of only about 2% or so. The cannabis that's currently available, at least flower cannabis, is close to 17 to 20%. And there are many other products, as you previously heard, that have a THC content of more than 90%. we know that the likelihood of getting addicted to cannabis is often driven by the THC content of cannabis. So the cannabis that's currently available is much more potent and therefore much more likely to lead to addiction. And what do I mean by addiction? These criteria that I've listed here are the same criteria we use to describe the addiction to any substance, including cocaine, alcohol, heroin, nicotine. That is, a person cannot control their use. They have problems with in school or with social life or with jobs. They use in risky situations such as driving. They may develop tolerance, that is, whereas one joint would get them to a certain level of high 1 year ago, now they need 2 joints to get to that point. And when they stop using or they abruptly stop, they may experience withdrawal symptoms. We know that both from animal studies and from human studies that the earlier the age of exposure to cannabis, the greater the chances of addiction. And when we look at the age of first exposure to cannabis in this country, it has been slowly dropping. So that is to say that kids are being exposed to cannabis a lot earlier now than, say, 20 years ago. There's also some data to suggest that exposure to cannabis in adolescence is a gateway drug. I have some question marks there because this has been fiercely debated, but it would suggest that exposure to cannabis can lead to other drug use, which may be even more problematic. So there's no question that people can get addicted to cannabis, especially nowadays when we have much more potent forms of cannabis. So just to make that point here, this is data from my lab. These are pictures of the brain, different slices of the brain. In the top panel are healthy controls. In the bottom panel or the middle panel are people who use cannabis on a daily basis. And what this image shows is the number of cannabis receptors in the brain. All of us have cannabis receptors or cannabinoid receptors, whether or not you smoke pot or not. Animals have it, so dogs have it, squirrels have it, birds have it. It's there and it serves an important purpose in our brains, and it's not really principally to get high. But what you see here is that with daily cannabis use, there is a reduction in the number of cannabinoid receptors. So this is some data to show that there are consequences to using cannabis on a daily basis that we can now capture using this technique called positron emission tomography. So what about the effects of cannabis on brain structure? As you know, the brain doesn't mature magically at the age of 18. Actually, brain development continues till about the age of 25. But there are some pretty critical periods of brain development, including early mid-adolescence, when the brain is essentially shrinking in size, meaning to say that connections that are necessary are made stronger and connections that are unnecessary are pruned away. And the brain's own endocannabinoid system seems to play some role during these critical neurodevelopment processes. And so when adolescents smoke cannabis, what they're doing is they're messing with this endocannabinoid system, and in doing so, it could mess up the wiring of their brain. So we think this is really important. It's very hard to study, obviously, but now we know that from animal studies, when animals are exposed to cannabis during early and mid-adolescence, there are significant consequences to that in later life. We have ways of actually looking at that using, for example, MRI and other techniques, and I'm going to share with you just some data that hopefully will be compelling to you. So this is a cartoon of the brain and showing this section called the prefrontal cortex, which is really an important part of the brain that really undergoes significant change during adolescence. And this other part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is very, very important in memory and learning. These are also areas of the brain that have very high densities of cannabinoid receptors. In a study that was published just last year in the highest impact journal in psychiatry, they compared adolescents who were using cannabis to adolescents who are not using cannabis. And what these brain sections show is the differences between the two. And what the studies concluded, and this was a well-powered study, that cannabis use during adolescence is associated with altered neurodevelopment. And the areas of the brain that seemed to show the greatest effect were the prefrontal cortex. This is the section of the brain that undergoes the greatest change during adolescence. This is what kids use to plan, to execute, to take risks or not take risks, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, they found that there was a relationship between the magnitude of cannabis exposure, that means how much kids were using, and these changes in the brain. So this was a correlation showing that the greater the cannabis use, the greater the thinning in the left and the right prefrontal cortices. We have an opportunity at Yale to actually look at the structure of the brain at a kind of microscopic level, or at the level of the synapse. And we find here in a study that I did and published a few years ago, that the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's really important in learning and memory, when we looked at people with cannabis use disorder versus controls shown in blue, we find that the number of synapses, or the synaptic density in the hippocampus, was lower in people with cannabis use disorder. And furthermore, they performed a lot worse on a task of memory that requires the hippocampus, suggesting that these changes in the density, this change in the density of synapses in the hippocampus may have some functional consequences. So there is now compelling data suggesting that exposure to cannabis in adolescence might be associated with long-term consequences in the brain. So last but not least, I'm a psychiatrist and I treat people with serious mental illness, and my specialty is treating people with psychotic disorders. And there's a growing literature suggesting that exposure to cannabis in adolescence is associated with, depending on the study that you look at, a 4 to 6 times higher risk of developing schizophrenia. Now, we don't have any ways of preventing schizophrenia. We can't change a person's genes, but what we can change is we can change some of the risk factors that might contribute to the development of schizophrenia. And one such risk factor is cannabis. So if you have a family member, a young kid who has or there's a family history of schizophrenia in the family, I would strongly advise you to speak to your adolescent kids to avoid using cannabis until after they are adults, because exposing them to cannabis during adolescence would be associated with a much higher risk of perhaps one of the worst of psychiatric disorders, which is schizophrenia. There's also some evidence suggesting that exposure to cannabis in adolescence is associated with mood and anxiety disorders. And then what about people who already have a psychiatric disorder like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder? I think there's fairly convincing data showing that those people with serious mental illness who use cannabis in them, they have much worse outcomes. They are more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to end up in the ER, more likely to be involved with the legal system, more likely to be homeless, more likely to lose jobs, and so on and so forth. So I think we are doing this grand experiment right now, and we're going to probably realize, 15 or 20 years from now, the true impact of some of the changes that we are currently making. So just to summarize, there are basically 6 concerns that I have. One is the effects of cannabis on cognitive processes that are necessary for scholastic life or the life of a student, the effects of cannabis on driving, the effects on brain development and the consequences thereof, the risk for serious mental illness, and the risk for in those who already have a serious mental illness, and then of course addiction. I'm going to stop there, and if you have questions, happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. D'Souza, not only providing the science, but giving us those real world examples to connect that all. That's very enlightening. Thank you. Next up to talk about what we see in the schools and what the schools are doing to help us and be a good partner to parents is Dr. Paul Freeman, our superintendent.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Dr. D'Souza, for the presentation. My portion of tonight's presentation is going to be brief. It's going to be relatively simple. I don't have slides to support it, but I'll start by talking about what the schools offer in partnership with the rest of the town as we look at this concern. First is I want to remind the community that the schools have been building a support system and have a support system in place to help students and families. To different levels across all of our schools, we have school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers, and the administrators who are in the buildings for families and for students to be able to reach out to for help. Those are resources that are in the buildings. Mike talked about coming in as a support counselor back in the early 90s and has moved through many of those positions. We also proactively address these topics in the schools with the students. Students need to be armed with information, and we bring these conversations to the students. Again, we do it in a developmentally appropriate way. In the elementary schools, we have students who are just beginning contact with some second step program classes that are offered generally through the school social workers in their classrooms. As students move into Baldwin and into the 5th grade, they move into a health program, a curriculum that follows them from 5th through 12th grade, where they begin to get more direct and more explicit information about concerns around things like tobacco use, alcohol use, marijuana use, and other drug uses. We also have an SRO who partners with us in our schools, works well with all of our administrators, is available to us as a resource. And in Guilford, we have the benefit of a really healthy mentoring program where we bring volunteers from the community into schools to work with students who we feel or whose parents feel are at greater risk. And they've got an additional layer of support and somebody that they can reach out to and speak with. To Lisa's earlier point, we've also really built and we've leaned on our student leaders. Every year at the high school, student leaders structure a day week where students who work with day bring into the school messages. You've seen the purple signs around, the purple flags that pop up around town annually, encouraging positive decision-making and celebrating students who aren't drug involved, who aren't regularly using. We really lean on those student leaders to help to push those messages out into the schools and into the community as well. We are, however, facing a new challenge. Mike touched on it, and I want to speak about it a little bit. The commercialization of THC marijuana products and the shift in the marketing of traditional tobacco products to vaping products has created a challenge for us in the schools. It first creates a simple challenge around monitoring. It used to be a greater risk for a child to consider the idea of using tobacco or using marijuana in a school setting when that use involved traditional smoking. It gave a trigger, there was a smell, it was easier for schools to monitor and to control. When a vaping product, when a vaping tool can be designed to have no smell at all, or a smell that disguises the product that's being smoked through the vaping product. And when THC products can come into the school looking like gummy bears or any other lunch item, it does create a challenge for us in the schools to be able to better monitor that use, which also means it creates a challenge for us in communicating back to the parents. So when we talk about the educational portion of this, it does become important for us and in the way that we speak about this with students in the schools. But it becomes all the more important for parents to have the conversations with your students, but also to become informed yourselves. Parents used to get warning signs if your student's backpack or jacket smelled of tobacco smoke or smelled of marijuana smoke. Those warning signals aren't just harder for school personnel to pick up, they're more challenging for parents to pick up now as well, which means that parents have to work on education themselves. And so again, thank you for this evening. But as parents, we need to be better educated and we need to be more vigilant and we need to be careful about falling into the never my kid trap. Even good kids make bad decisions, and it really becomes incumbent on parents in this changing commercial landscape to keep an open mind and to continue to be educated. And then I just want to finish my comments by mentioning a strength. And again, Lisa spoke to this in her opening comments. A real strength in Guilford around this topic and around most topics is the partnership that exists between the schools and the community at large. I've worked in other communities and in other school systems, and oftentimes conversations about marijuana use, drug use, devolve into the statement that Guilford High School has a drug problem, or the high school in any blank town has a drug problem. I can assure you that there's no single high school that has a drug problem that is divorced from the community itself. High schools exist in communities. Never in the history of schools have there been high school students who have had drug problems or have been drug involved. There are children who live in communities who struggle with drug involvement, who struggle with tobacco or alcohol use. And the schools are an important component of that because we bring the children of a community together, but the challenge doesn't exist in the school apart from the community. What we do really well in Guilford is we recognize that, and we recognize that we're talking about our kids. We're not talking about their students. And conversations like tonight, the work that Day does, the data that Day collects and aggregates and shares with the community, and activities that get put together like a night out hosted by the Guilford Police Department, activities run by Guilford Park and Rec, or services offered from organizations like Guilford Youth and Family. That's the strength of this community. And that's how we're going to continue to support our kids, even in this changing commercial landscape. And so Jen, thanks for letting me be part of this tonight. And I'm looking forward to questions at the end as everybody else is.
Thank you so much. Gone are the days of the big assemblies that we know from the 90s, at least for me.
They don't work.
Those are gone. They don't work.
Getting all of our kids together in a great big room and allowing them to roll their eyes at us is not going to solve the problem. There's better ways.
Thank you. So next up, we have our first selectman, Matt Hoy. And Matt, we're going to respect that you absolutely have to keep neutrality on this issue, being in your position. But if you could provide some insight about Guilford and where they are with the retail marijuana, we'd be most appreciative.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Also, thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this important community forum, engagement, dialogue, call it what you will, on what is a critical topic given the recent changes in legislation. I'd also like to, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Bo Hewen for all he has done over so many years to protect the youth of this community. And the same goes to Lisa, Susie, Jennifer, the PTOs for pulling this forum together tonight. Also, this is the second time I've heard Dr. D'Souza's and Mike Regan's presentations, and I picked up a little bit more, and my congratulations to you, both of you, for hitting the nail right on the head. I also would be remiss if I didn't to shout out to a couple of my colleagues who are here, who are interested in this topic, very interested in this topic. Sue Renner and Charles Haverda, both members of the Board of Selectmen with me, were on this call earlier when I checked. And then lastly, I'm never surprised, but always impressed by my colleague, Dr. Paul Freeman, my partner in managing this community, one of the partners in managing this community. I'm always impressed by his ability to speak eloquently on on any topic. So the town's exposure to this problem, and I think Susan White can probably attest to this, Mike, in your previous days too. Our exposure is usually is more often seen through the eyes of those folks in the Youth and Family Services Organization, because clearly some of those problems manifest themselves in families as well as children, and they often wind up with some kind of clinical exposure and treatment in our facility. And this might sound a little bit trite, but I am fond of the saying, knowledge is power, and a community is always stronger when it is informed. And that is clearly what tonight is or has been about. I plead the fifth on my own experiences related to marijuana, but clearly the research that has been done and what has been presented to you tonight on the impact of developing brains was not available. And I think Jennifer said 40, 50, 60 years ago. Mike or Jennifer might have said that, and in my case, it's about 50 years ago when I was 15. But clearly the potency variables that we heard about tonight are starkly different, and educating parents and our youth to the challenges and the dangers with those potency levels is imperative. Well, tonight is not the forum for discussing the Board of Selectmen's pending decision on the sale, cultivation, production of marijuana. We purposely waited until these forums were announced and conducted to engage the community in our own series of discussions and try to inform ourselves as to what we do with that decision. As most of you know, we put a moratorium in place that extends and ends on June 30th. What we have done is we've engaged a social media polling entity who will conduct digital polling of the Guilford community. And we will be hosting some public forums at large relative to the issue itself of marijuana sales and availability in this community. But what is clear about what we've heard tonight is that now, much more than ever, this is much more than just smoking a couple of joints. And to educate the parents and people of my generation who grew up when that's all you had with marijuana was, Mexican or the more expensive stuff, and that's what determined the potency. Today, kids, as we heard, are not going to know what they're getting very often when they try something. So this forum, I think, is helpful informing our decision, at least mine, and I suggest the same is probably true for both Susan and Charles. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate tonight, and I urge all of you to participate in the upcoming forums that will be held by the Board of Selectmen. So thank you, Jennifer, and I yield the floor.
Thank you. When did you say when the social media polling would be taking place about?
Was purposely held off until after the series. So we're finalizing the questions with the polling company to make sure we get the right kind of information that we're looking for. This is way beyond my capacity to understand, but this will all be done via the technology that allows big advertising agencies to identify when you are in a certain geographic location. And this is probably going to be done largely through cell phone technology.
Thank you. Next is the next topic that we're going to cover is very important. It's what parents can do. So we have Liz McCall here. She's a family clinician from Project Courage. So Liz, welcome to the floor.
Have my mute. Thank you. So yeah, we've heard from a lot of key players in the community, and we've heard from them about the impact of marijuana in a lot of different domains. We're, consistent messaging between school and home. We've talked about the impact of the brain and of THC on the brain and the brain structures. We've heard the students' input and polling on their use and their risk tolerance and what they believe the problem is. But what's really important for parents to know about substance abuse, whether it's THC, alcohol, nicotine, even technology and food, video gaming, is the open and honest conversation about these topics. It is really important for us to remember that if we can't establish open and honest communication in our families, then we are going to put up a barrier to our children feeling safe about talking about these things. What we see is that individuals that come to us are using substances as coping mechanisms. When we begin to feel emotionally overwhelmed, so if you can imagine, food is a very good example of how we might see this happening. You've had a very long day at work, you're driving home, you know that Burger King is not healthy, you know that you shouldn't stop there. In that moment, your emotions can take over and we can make these decisions that aren't in our best interest. As a young adolescent, that becomes more complicated because, as Dr. D'Souza pointed out, in the development of the brain and the prefrontal cortex not being there, and a lot of bottom brain functioning, which is our impulses and basically feeding, fighting, fleeing, and fornicating is what the bottom brain is concerned with. And when we are working from that and we are working from emotions that we don't completely understand, we are more inclined to reach for something to medicate, to not feel. So when we see adolescents triggered by an emotion, we're all triggered by an emotion. We don't have control over them. In that moment, for us, we might pull into Burger King, right? And then the next time we're driving home and we're emotionally overwhelmed, our brain might say, well, hey, remember last time we pulled into Burger King and we did feel better, right? So we start to wear these pathways in the brain. And so when we talk about addiction and we talk about the impact of substances on the brain, this is where it's no longer becoming a choice. Our brain takes over, and the goal is to, as quickly as we can, achieve the end, the fastest means to our end. And so in that moment of emotional overwhelm, we don't want to feel. This is a brain that's not even certain what it's feeling, having difficulty identifying emotions. What's the difference between stress and anxiety? What's the difference between sadness and depression? What's the difference between frustration and anger? And so by having open and honest conversation, by allowing our children and young adults to find safety in being vulnerable in those conversations, we give them the opportunity to explore with us and explore themselves the nature of the emotions not feeling and why they would reach for substances. A very important piece to that open and honest conversation is keeping boundaries in place around substance use. Not just substance use, but also risky behaviors and other things that are associated and can lead to substance abuse. Boundaries are not rules. They're not meant to be punitive. This is a way for our lives as parents to be manageable. And if we do not communicate our expectations, I hate to use the word fair, but it's almost not fair to have expectations of somebody if you're not going to communicate those to them. So for example, at a very young age, and we're seeing, unfortunately, it's starting younger and younger, as Dr. Freeman pointed out, and Dr. D'Souza, in the development of the brain and other panel members, but that middle school and as young as we can have these conversations, that we expect abstinence from substances, right? And that's not a rule for all homes. That's not a boundary for all homes. I just said they're not rules. So it's not a boundary for all homes. Every home runs very differently. So your boundaries are unique to you. But be very clear about what your expectation is around substances, nicotine, alcohol. and include all substances. We're seeing a trend toward LSD and mushrooms because it's very hard to test for those. The good thing about that, not that there is a good thing, is that it's very clear indication when somebody is under the influence of those things, unlike marijuana, nicotine. There's a very outward exhibit of use. And when you're putting these expectations in place, it's also important to have a consequence attached. That is not a punishment. This is that you can make the choice all day long around what you're going to do here. But if you do this choice outside of our boundaries and outside of our expectations, then there is going to be a consequence attached. So I'm going to leave it there for questions or comments and for the rest of the group to have that opportunity. Thanks, Jennifer.
Certainly, thank you. It's a great way to approach this. And finally, we're going to bring Lisa back. Lisa's going to actually present us with some additional resources that will help us as parents or community members when we're talking to our kids. Lisa?
Sorry, I was on mute also. Let's see, I did just want to share my screen, but I'm having trouble, the control panel's in the way. That disappear? There we go. This is Guilford Day's website. You know, we're throwing a lot of information at you all at once, and I just wanted to let you know that you know, we are always happy to talk with you anytime you have questions. But also there's some terrific resources on here. Let's Mention Prevention is a great program. There are we'll continue to add messages. We encourage you to share the messages on your social media. That's all developing with other local youth and family service organizations that are also in the area. We also have information on substances such as marijuana. And so if you're interested in further information, there's plenty here. There's I apologize, is long, but we give you information underneath where you can jump to a key piece of the information if you only have a little bit of time. Same thing with Dr. Bertha Madras from Harvard. There's information there that you can jump to. We've got some, the Surgeon General's advisory, so all of that's available. But what I wanted to let you know is that there we go. Big Marijuana is the latest iteration of Big Tobacco. And so there's going to be some strong media messaging coming out as our legalization of commercialized marijuana starts getting launched. So we're going to really need to work hard. I know I said this at the beginning, but we really are going to need to work hard as a community, not just with the schools, not just with Guilford Day or Youth and Family Services. We're really going to need to work hard together to get the message out to kids. It's so interesting, you know, even when they're rolling their eyes, my kids are all in their 20s now, but even when they're rolling their eyes and they really look like they're not paying attention to you, they are. They absolutely are. And so talking with your kids a lot, we used to chat to the point with our kids that, you know, we could joke around about it. That makes a huge difference. And also talking with other parents. really supporting each other. I used to, run outside in bare feet when a kid was getting picked up, because with texting, it's not like, the parents would be calling back and forth naturally. And I felt like an absolute weirdo, but it was really neat that the other parents that I was connecting with really appreciated it. We have a safe home, safe parties program, which COVID has definitely had an effect on, but you can sign up for that and take a pledge that your home is a safe place for kids to gather, and that you'll follow the rules of, the laws. And excuse me, I apologize. Definitely let the town know what your thoughts are. Civic engagement, fill out those surveys, send an email, absolutely be a part of things. And then, I really do encourage you to consider joining Guilford Day. I cannot tell you enough how much of a difference it makes to be able to have a conversation in the kitchen with your kids. Say, is this idea going to work, or to hear something about what their thoughts are, to get an idea. And Pete Palumbo has a 4th grader, so he's getting to that stage, but Donna Tostas and my kids are definitely on the older side, so we really could use some younger families involved with us. And I want to say thank you so much. So I think we can open it up for questions now. I saw somebody had a comment, and we can go from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I also just want to stress your father, Bo, really was a driving force in bringing us all together and making this happen. And I think something that just struck me that he said is that the best way to treat is to prevent, so that you don't have to get down there, and that's starting conversations early and having them often. So this is wonderful. Thank you. We did have a question in the chat. I have a comment on the subject of preventing addiction. I appreciate Liz's points about emotions and how adolescents have a low functioning prefrontal cortex. I would love to see a whole district collaboration around emotional intelligence. Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence offers a wonderful program, Ruler. I would absolutely love to see GPS invest in this program for our students. Please consider. So it's more of a statement, but that's so helpful to have these types of things brought up. And I believe you addressed perception of risk earlier, that came up earlier. Does anybody else have any questions out there that they'd either like to type? And I see Liz, did you raise your hand on that?
Yeah, I was going to address something that Lisa had mentioned previous, if there weren't questions, but we could get to the questions first, and I can bring it up later if we have time.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. We did have something from Nicole. Do you find an increased incidence of drug abuse correlated to computer addiction? And if so, does this relate to pathways being etched in a child's mind for more, with a child seeking one sort of gratification might be more susceptible? To Liz. Oh, no, sorry, that was not. That's Nicole's question. Do we have a panelist who thinks that they can address this question about higher drug abuse related to other addictions, such as screen addictions?
I could take a shot at that. So, there's a reward pathway in the brain, which is activated by many different kinds of rewards. It could be food, sex, drugs, and playing video games. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that these could translate across each other.
Thank you. Sorry, I think I might have missed, as we discuss this very important topic, I'm reminded of my public health education and how we must consider the whole person when looking at an issue. Keeping kids off drugs and alcohol is a lot of the reason why I entered the field. Part of looking at the whole person is including physical activity and healthy socialization. Basketball courts, currently in the news, absolutely. I don't think there's a parent here that isn't aware, absolutely. The courts are a great deterrent from drugs and other illegal activity. Excellent point. We have selectmen all here to see that, thank you. And I'm sure they're taking all of these comments into consideration, absolutely. And then we have a thank you for the information and the time. I don't see any other questions coming in unless I missed one.
One thing I really did want to say is thank you, Jennifer, for mentioning it, but prevention really is so much easier than trying to help a kid who has gone down the path toward addiction. So it is absolutely worth the effort in the beginning to try and I mean, with little kids, you can have conversations about being healthy. You can have conversations about being a good friend and respecting boundaries and that kind of thing. There's all sorts of good decision making, you know, all of that kind of thing can start taking place with kids in nursery school. So this really is something that starts early and can make a difference, can make an enormous difference, both with your, you know, well-being and also with your finances as time goes on. So thank you.
That's a great point. We actually had a meeting last week and we had it with people who'd be in front of youth, whether it was scouts, sporting coaches, PTOs, churches, youth groups. They were all invited and saw this as well. So, you know, if you're a parent on here, I would absolutely follow up with them and encourage them to also make sure that they're keeping an eye out because it does take a village. And Liz, were
Lisa,
you gonna-
just another, oh, I'm sorry. It's just another great example of the opportunities that Guilford affords, right? From school-based activities to park and rec activities to the Guilford Arts Center. There are so many opportunities to private organizations that provide lessons and training and after-school activities. It really is important to make sure that you've got your children busy and engaged and finding passions that are positive that they can build on for life. It's a wonderful opportunity in this community to find those resources.
Agreed. Dr. D'Souza, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a few brief comments. One was that I think the best way for us to be informed instead of starting the experiment is to look at what happened in Colorado. I think we can learn some important lessons from families and communities out in Colorado about the impact of commercialization. And that brings me to the point that this is not about legalization. This is really about commercialization. So there are commercial entities whose mission, like any good commercial entity, is to sell as much product. And so they are going to want to sell as much of cannabis and cannabis-based products to people. What the alcohol and tobacco companies realize very early on is a young user is a lifelong user. So don't be surprised if there'll be thinly veiled advertising and marketing specifically directed to young people. Because once you get a young person, a young brain hooked on a substance, whether it's nicotine or alcohol, then you have a lifelong customer. I think parents need to be really aware of that. I have to say that even before retail marijuana has become completely freely available in Connecticut, our kids already have access to marijuana, and we know from other states that with legalization and commercialization, that's only going to to rise. And the message that our kids are getting is very confusing for them, because on the one hand, they're hearing about medical marijuana, which by their interpretation of that is if it's medical, it must be okay. and that's very hard for them to understand that this other side of the story, that there are consequences to their learning, to driving, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Liz, I feel like you were going to say something a moment ago. And you're on mute.
Thank you. Lisa had brought up that, some of the questions that had come up from parents, and one in particular that we hear a lot. And that is, when I'm having a conversation with my children about substances and marijuana specifically, and they ask me if I used when I was younger. And it's a great question, because this is all about opening those doors to communication. So certainly we would never want to lie to our children. However, how we present that information is the most important piece. So for example, yes, I did try it. However, I tried it because I was struggling with some of my peer relationships. My things at home were unstable at that time, or I was struggling in school. And the reasons I used it were very unhealthy. I was trying to avoid or escape, or, kind of put a Band-Aid on what was happening in my life. And that's not healthy. And so I realized that there is no healthy reason to use THC for an adolescent. And again, this is opening that doors of communication. But we don't, that blaming or the punitive piece when we're having conversations with our children, we don't want to be our children's first bully. So always trying to come from a place of compassion, being open and honest and kind, and establishing that safety. Thanks.
Absolutely. And I see a hand up, so I'm going to try this. This is a new technology for me. I don't usually go this far, but Bo, that's you. So if you want to unmute yourself, you can
Okay,
direct
good.
the question.
This is a question I direct to Liz, or maybe even to Mike Regan. And that is that it can be really, really, really tough for a parent to find help if their kid has become addicted to marijuana and the kid's brain isn't working right at the point the parent stumbles across it and comes out of denial and, and realizes what a problem they have on their hands. And I know that there's a real lack of in-person treatment places where a kid can be sent. And I really wasn't even sure where you would recommend a parent turn for help and treatment for their kid. Liz, I wasn't sure if Project Courage takes on, say, a high school sophomore who's, who's angry and refusing to go for help and maybe threatening to run away, or whether there is somewhere else you would recommend that parents go. And Mike, I imagine you ran into that as a drug counselor many, many times over the years.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. I didn't know if you had something you wanted to address before I. All right, I'll just go ahead. So yes, so Project Courage, we do take adolescents as young as 14, all the way up to 80 years old. And kicking, resisting, denying, absolutely. It is hard to find help, but we also will see parents without their child. So parents can come into Project Courage for coaching around the issue. How do I get my child the help that they need? How do I have this conversation with them? What do I do when my child does A and B? And so Project Courage does provide that support for parents, even if their child is not involved initially. We have groups available. It's an intensive outpatient program where they come for 3 hours a day, and it's after school hours. So they would be here from 3:30 to 6:30 if that's the treatment recommendation after an intake. We also provide individual therapy if that's the level of care that's determined for them. So there's a lot of stuff going on. We also have a STEPS program, and this is an alternative to being in school. So if a child is expelled, if a child is unable to manage being in a school setting, we have an opportunity for them here to get academic assistance. We work very closely with the school system. It can be for maybe, a period of time when they're expelled, or for a little bit longer of time, if they're struggling with some mental health stuff that keeps them unable to, really function in the classroom setting.
And Bo, I would just add to your question, Project Courage was started by a person who grew up in Guilford, and I got to know him pretty well way back in the day. And in my opinion, there's no one better qualified to handle the angry adolescent. But the other thing that Project Courage offers, because one of the big things that Andy Baccaro, who started it, found was that there was a huge difference in the treatment of adolescents than the treatment of adults. And a lot of models were predicated on that. And so I think what the idea is, and Bo, back in the old days, just send your kid away, hope they get fixed, and have them come back. And that's not really realistic these days. So I think a lot more successful programs are finding a way to integrate a kid's normal life if they can maintain themselves in school. Project Courage has school-based clinicians. If they can do that, great, but it's only when they get to the end of the spectrum that they might need some type of inpatient care. But by the same token, they're also a resource for all other adolescent programs around, because there is a network of treatment facilities and clinicians who specialize, like Dr. D'Souza, in specific areas. And you really need someone who understands adolescence and addiction to be able to be effective, in my opinion, my experience.
Thanks, Mike, you're hired.
I actually was texted a question, and someone wanted to know, is there a minimum age that we see, or maybe not so much minimum age, but what is usually that starting age where you might see from a school's perspective, where children, adolescents, teens, where are they starting to use, what grades, what ages?
Mike, I might defer to you. Your experience would be a great place to speak from on this question.
Well, one of the things about being in a middle school is that I worked at high school for a long, long time. I've worked with young people at the very end of the extreme. And so 7th and 8th graders think that what they're doing, no one else has ever done before. And so, we kind of have a little bit of an advantage, because we know when kids start to change, or kids start to change their socialization, or we start hearing from the parents and that sort of thing. And so, age of first initiation, as we talked about, is a very big component to, how at risk a kid is going to become as a result. But I think that what has happened over the course of time, and I don't know if it was in any of the statistics, I know it's out there, is that the age of first initiation has lowered. And so you have greater access, easier to conceal. You pursue drug-seeking behavior, but I think that the age of initiation for many kids has lowered to the point of 13, 14 with these particular products.
Thank you. We just got a message in our chat. This sounds very kind and supportive, and sounds like our community is wrapping its arms around our children. Can Mr. Regan and Dr. Freeman speak a bit about what the actual punitive measures are that are taken when children possess THC products on school grounds? Great question.
It is a good question, and there are punitive measures, but what is important to us is that there are never only punitive measures. We will follow state requirements. We will follow Board of Education policy, but we don't just discipline. We also make sure that we reach out to the families. We want to make sure that there's an educational component, and we want to make sure that there is a counseling component. Students who are found to be in possession of marijuana or any other illicit drug on school property will face suspension. Students who have repeat offenses and being in possession on school property could face expulsion. And students who distribute marijuana or any other illicit or controlled substance on school property must face expulsion. It is a state requirement. So we will follow state and board policy. We will put disciplinary measures in place, but we think that the educational and the therapy and the counseling components are more important. And oftentimes we will use the discipline as a lever to make sure that we can get parents to recognize that there is an issue that needs to be addressed, and to make sure that we can get the supports and counseling in place.
I'm muted. Now I fell in that trap. Is Narcan available at all schools in the event it is needed?
Yes, Narcan is stocked in all of our schools, and all of our school nurses are trained in the use of Narcan. That's a great question. I really appreciate it.
I just wanted to add that issued a warning a couple of months ago that some of the marijuana that was being sold in Connecticut was spiked with fentanyl. And
Yes.
this is really a huge problem, and goes back to the point earlier that when kids are smoking some drug or getting their hands on a drug, they have no idea what it contains.
And I feel like I may have missed a hand. Did somebody have their hand raised? That was in the audience. But was that you?
I forgot to put my hand down, but I'm all set.
It popped up as two though, so it looked like someone additional to you, but it wasn't giving me a name.
You must be exhausted, Bo.
I just want to jump into, I'm going to put my email address in the chat box if anyone ever does want to reach out with questions or get involved, or even just be added to our day email list. I'll put that there, and feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Susie. It looks like we've cleared all our questions. Susie, maybe you can just double check for me. I don't see any more hands.
Yep, I don't see anything else either.
Okay, great. Oh, what? Oh, that's you in the chat, sorry.
Yep, just me.
Oh, Danny Howard saying thank you. I was actually just about to thank Danny for all of her help, repping the PTOs from the high school in Adams, Ornella Rulo gathering for the elementary schools, Lisa, Bo, getting us all together, Dr. Freeman, Matt, always consummate leaders with wonderful information and perspective, Mr. Regan. I don't envy your position that you're in here with these 7th and 8th graders and juggling all these things and being a great communicator with us. I'm so happy that my kids get to go through your hands, so thank you. Dr. D'Souza, you had wonderful information last week, even expanded on that this week. I think it really kind of, hits a nail on the head on why this is such an important topic. And Liz, thank you for giving us all of those resources. It's really wonderful. And I encourage everyone to reach out to Guilford Day. with any questions, if you need resources, if you want to recap anything with here. I believe that this was recorded and it will be posted for future use. Susie White, thank you for being the woman behind the curtain and doing all of this with us as well, and getting things organized. I really appreciate it. So with that, everyone, have a good night and thank you again.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone.